To be Rome's princeps, or first man, the most eminent, the most powerful, and the most important Roman of his day, was the goal of every senator dating back centuries, though in reality, only a very few could achieve it. It was the race to be Rome's princeps which led Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla to their respective choices, ultimately hurling Rome into civil war. It was the same motivation which drove Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, following the death of Sulla, to raise a rebellion against Rome's conservative faction, and it was the driving force behind the conspiracy of Lucius Sergius Catilina. So too was the three-way alliance known as the First Triumvirate, an ongoing pursuit of the title princeps for its individual members, Caesar, Pompeius and Crassus. Although his reputation for wealth had made the name Marcus Licinius Crassus a byword for greed, the life of Crassus, between the years of 83 and 57 BC, tells of a man for whom wealth was merely a means to an end, a path to power. Not unlike the massive legions wielded by Pompeius Magnus in his own quest for power, wealth was the tool of choice used by Marcus Licinius Crassus to negotiate his way to the top of Rome's elite. This was made obvious by Crassus's personal behavior. He was known to grant exorbitant loans to friends, without charging interest. Cicero tells us that although Crassus entertained liberally, he was never vulgar, and lived a quiet, unassuming life. Crassus was extremely courteous, possessing a dignified countenance. His speeches in the law courts were simple, clean, and well constructed. And, according to Cicero, Crassus, unlike Pompeius Magnus, made himself hospitably accessible. As a child, Crassus had grown up in his father's command tents, accompanying him to his governorship in Hispania, and even serving under his father during Rome's social war. Following Gaius Marius's invasion of Rome, Crassus's father and brother were hunted down and slaughtered along with the rest of the conservatives, forcing the young Crassus to flee Rome. Raising his own legions in Hispania, from among his late father's veterans, Crassus ultimately found himself supporting Sulla in Greece. Crassus fought alongside Sulla against Mithridates, and was single-handedly responsible for turning the tide of the Battle of the Colline Gate in Sulla's favor. Having restored his family's entirely depleted wealth, Crassus rose to become one of Rome's wealthiest men, using that wealth to climb the cursus honorum. Elected to the praetorship in 73 BC, Crassus not only used his wealth to raise 6 legions with which to confront Spartacus and his army of slaves, but he volunteered for the task. And though victory over Spartacus would launch a decade-long feud between himself and Pompeius, Crassus, once again, used his wealth to set up 10,000 tables, laden with free food, as a feast for the people of Rome, on the same day Pompeius Magnus celebrated his second triumph. Both Crassus and Pompeius had been lieutenants under the dictator Sulla. From Sulla, Pompeius learned the art of overwhelming one's enemies by sheer numbers. It was Sulla who had given Pompeius his first special command, along with 6 legions, approximately 30,000 men, and a fleet of approximately 1,000 ships. Pompeius also learned how to stage temper tantrums with legions as a backdrop, as a method of extracting even more special commands from the Senate, each with increasing benefit to himself. This culminated in the Lex Gabinia, granting Pompeius approximately 120,000 troops, 5,000 cavalry, and 500 warships, as well as bestowing on him unprecedented individual power over almost all of Rome's territories. But Crassus had learned something quite different from the dictator Sulla. Even after stepping down from the dictatorship, Sulla maintained control over the Senate until his retirement, and even then still held sufficient sway to affect political outcomes. From Sulla, Crassus learned that being the face of power was less important than being the true power. And so, following his 70 BC consulship, Crassus turned down the chance to govern a province, choosing instead to remain in Rome, where he could groom and sponsor upcoming young politicians he deemed useful to his agenda. Besides throwing his wealth behind Caesar, who clearly had potential, and could be expected to easily reach the consulship, it was rumored that Marcus Licinius Crassus had invested heavily in Lucius Sergius Catilina, so much so that it was said that if Catilina had succeeded in creating his government in waiting, Crassus was to be the new government's dictator, with Caesar serving as magister equitum, or master of the horse. During the Catilina debates, a senator by the name of Tarquinius accused Crassus of involvement in the conspiracy. Crassus' reputation, however, was so sterling, that the Senate shouted him down. Even Cato, Bibulus, and the other conservatives, who easily believed Caesar was involved, were among those yelling false witness on Crassus's behalf. Another recipient of Crassus's patronage was Publius Clodius, who escaped conviction for the desecration of the Bona Dea thanks to large bribes paid by Crassus. And when Clodius accepted a large bribe to legislate the release of Pompeius's war prisoner, Tigranes the Younger, it was rumored that bribe came from Crassus, who enjoyed watching Pompeius suffer at the hands of Clodius. At the beginning of his 59 BC consulship, Caesar consistently called upon Crassus to speak ahead of any others within the Senate, an indication that Caesar deemed Crassus the senior partner within the three-way alliance. It's even possible that it was Crassus, and not Caesar, that was the author of the agreement between the Triumvirs. In 60 BC, at the inception of the agreement, Pompeius was Rome's most decorated general. He had decades' worth of military accomplishments, had celebrated 3 triumphs over 3 continents, and had served as consul 7 years before the legal age of 42. Pompeius was Rome's rock star. Crassus was the Senate's most eminent member. He won the Battle of the Colline Gate for Sulla. He wiped out the slave army led by Spartacus and crucified 6,000 slaves along the Via Appia as a deterrent against future slave revolts. Also an ex-consul, Crassus came from a multi-generational consular family with excellent standing within Rome's Senate. His wealth had not only sponsored many a sitting senator, but had fed Rome, not as the duty of an office, but as a gift. On the merits of a glorious record in the Senate, and with the people of Rome, Crassus had spent the previous decade advancing politicians as if pawns on a chessboard. Caesar, on the other hand, who in 60 BC was merely consul-elect, had won only a single victory with his defeat of a small area in Hispania known as Lusitania. And, more than 2 decades had elapsed since Caesar was awarded the civic crown for holding his ground at the siege of Mytilene. Caesar's only real claim to fame was as the nephew of Gaius Marius, a claim which came with the adoration of the common people, but the disdain of Rome's conservative aristocracy. Caesar had achieved the office of praetor only through the patronage of Crassus, who had also funded his elections as aedile and Pontifex Maximus. It seems unlikely that Caesar, as the triumvir with the least amount of prestige, had the wherewithal to manipulate Rome's 2 most important men into an alliance destined to favor Caesar. But, it is possible that a master manipulator, like Crassus, saw Caesar as the perfect tool to further his own agenda. Caesar was the political heir of Gaius Marius. He came with the support of the populists. Pompeius considered himself the political heir of the dictator Sulla, and came with the support of the conservatives. Because Crassus had remained neutral, neither siding with, nor alienating these opposing parties, he stood to gain the most through the creation of the Triumvirate. As consul, Caesar would use force to pass legislation beneficial to Crassus. Caesar would accomplish this with the support, and under the threat of Pompeius and all his legions. And even though Pompeius would win the ratifications of the eastern settlements he'd conquered, ratifications which Crassus had fought, his alliance with Caesar would separate him from his support within the Senate. With both Caesar and Pompeius isolated from the Senate, and viewed as bullies, Crassus had only to turn them against one another through the agency of Publius Clodius, who was still being compensated by Crassus. Once Caesar and Pompeius destroyed each other, Marcus Licinius Crassus would be the last man standing, earning himself the title of princeps. But the triumvirate had not played out as he had hoped. Crassus had underestimated his opponent's desires to be first. By the end of 57 BC, Cicero and Pompeius had manufactured another special command, and Caesar was performing staggeringly well in Gaul. Caesar had acquired new lands for Rome, and was now sending back enough wealth to buy his own politicians. Caesar's prestige was fast taking on a life of its own. Caesar was suddenly one of the very few people, like Crassus and Pompeius, who could actually attain the title of first man. And as Caesar's prestige grew, Crassus's hold over him would decline. almost succeeding in using the Triumvirate to pit Caesar and Pompeius first against the Senate, and then against one another. The balance of power within the Triumvirate had now changed, and Crassus suddenly looked the weakest. If he wanted to meet Caesar and Pompeius on equal ground, Crassus realized he needed a campaign of his own. Marcus Licinius Crassus could no longer afford to sit quietly in the shadows, only skilled at maneuvering others.